Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Tonight we'll be finding out more about a medieval manuscript which is considered the first book documenting Manx history. But before then, we'll return to the theme of last week's programme, when we found out more about the Nautical Museum in Castletown. Until 2013, the feature piece of the museum was George Quayle's boat, the Peggy, but she's currently undergoing a painstaking conservation project, something Objects Conservator for Manx National Heritage Christopher Weeks is heavily involved in.
We are now in an industrial unit outside Douglas, and this is the one which is currently housing Peggy for the duration of its conservation treatment.
So what are the conditions like in here? How are you maintaining the conditions that you need?
Damp and horrible, but that's what the boat wants just at the moment. It's involved installing humidification equipment and also dehumidification equipment to try to maintain a quite precise control on the atmosphere in here, because what we don't want is for the boat to dry out, because it was very damp. It was used to being very damp where it lived before in its cellar. And if we allow it then to dry out, it will simply fall to pieces because it's entirely fixed with rusty nails, and those nails have rusted to quite a substantial degree. They're not really holding the boat together very well any longer. And if we allow the boat to dry, the timber will shrink, the nails will fail, and the boat will fall to pieces. So we have to try to keep it damp until we know what to do next. But I'm speaking as if that's in the future, but we actually know what we're doing now, so we've started to dry it very, very slowly. But the plant is designed to allow us to do that in a very controlled manner, and we are drying the boat to a specific level that we have arrived at through consultation with our timber engineers, which is going to reduce the risk of further decay. It's a particular level that we're aiming at, but we have to go very slowly, so it's going to take about 2 years.
Can we have a look at the boat itself?
We can.
What kind of vessel is it?
Well, it is the kind of vessel that if you were 250 years old, you would recognise as absolutely ubiquitous. Because, for example, in the 19th century, out of Douglas, there were 600 of these in Douglas, and they were going in the middle of the 19th century, going in and out on the herring fishery. They're called shallops, and they have quite a deep draw on the keel. That's because they have to navigate choppy, windy waters, and they're specifically designed for coming into rocky coves and inlets, and they're quite manoeuvrable. This one is not very big. It's 26 foot or 8 metres long. It was locally built, so it's the kind of boat that you would have seen absolutely everywhere. But the way that George Quayle wanted it designed was as a rather low sort of racing yacht. So its lines actually are rather racy, but the hull form is a shallop, and they're the craft that was used everywhere. This is the only one in the world left, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you think. So it's an amazing relic, Now that you've got it out of the cellar and you've had a good look at it, what have you found that you didn't know before? Is there anything you found out about it that you didn't know? Oh, too much, even to mention in detail. But I think the most amazing thing that I've discovered really is just how handmade it was, made by a man called Kelly, funnily enough, in Castletown in 1789, but made by hand with axes and adzes. And it really shows they used timber that they really understood, naturally crooked oak timber for the frames and so on. And it's just it's a beautifully handmade object, handcrafted object. And even in the middle of the 19th century, boats weren't made exactly like that. So this is an extraordinary survival from the previous century. Practically speaking, the only one there is. Because of the other boats, the very small handful of boats of a similar age, boats and ships, of a similar age to Peggy, which you can count on the fingers of 2 hands very, very easily. Most of those have been restored and restored and restored, and hardly any original material remains, whereas this one is in its original condition, and it really is a beautiful thing to see, actually.
And it's essentially 2 boats?
Yes, 2 boats superimposed on. So not only have we got one 18th century craft, which is vanishingly rare, we've got 2, because the original form of this was a sort of sleek racing vessel, but I think George Quayle, we surmise that he was frustrated with the amount of water that was slopping over him when he was sailing it. So after about 10 years, in about 1802, he raised the gunwales. He made it taller so that it wouldn't ship so much water. He made some modifications. He moved the masts around. He basically converted it into a schooner that would have been easy for him to sail more or less on his own. So we've got the earliest surviving schooner in front of us, as well as anything else in the world. But underneath that is the earlier boat. We're not exactly sure how that was rigged or where the masts were, but we've got two 18th century vessels in front of us. And the archaeology of all that is still right in front of us. And that's to say that it's unique would to do it terrible disservice, because it's of stratospheric international significance.
And what condition is she actually in?
Well, remarkably good, really, considering. I mean, if you lay down in a pool of water for 200 years, you'd be feeling a bit rough by the end of it. Sure enough, there's quite a lot of rot, because she was in a very damp cellar that flooded tidally. But given all of that, it's quite amazing how it has survived. What we've seen over the last 10 years, though, especially while it was still in its cellar, was an increasingly frequent occurrence of small losses, bits dropping off, because we're getting to the point now where the nails that are holding it together are so corroded that they're not doing their job any longer. It's more than gravity that's holding it together. It's pinched together at fore and aft, and it can't really fall apart so very easily because each plank overlays the other, as it's a clinker-built vessel. So it can't simply fall to pieces. But superficial bits have been dropping off in increasing numbers over the last decade, and that had to be dealt with. And the only way to do that is to reduce the amount of water in the boat, which currently stands at about 30%. It's about 30% water. We know this because we've measured it.
Is this just the drying out process, reducing water?
Yes, so we need to reduce that water content down to more manageable levels. About, shall we say, 14% water would be more manageable. If we're able to do that, then we'll obviate the further risk of fungal attack, so rot, that kind of thing. And we'll also discourage insects from eating it. But this is done by drying out the atmosphere around the boat and waiting for the boat to respond. And we have to do that very, very slowly, because if we don't, there'll be unfortunate tensions in the timbers and it'll start springing and cracking. So we have to do it very, very slowly. I said before it's about 2 years. While we're doing that, I'm monitoring the boat by taking successive three-dimensional images of it to see what the difference is between them, and to see if I can spot anything nasty on the horizon, any nasty stresses that's going to result in something embarrassing happening. But I'm fairly confident that we can get the boat to the required level of moisture content without anything drastic happening and without too much shrinkage. But it has to be done very gradually, and I have to keep my eye on it.
So if you had to sum up the significance of the vessel, what would it be?
Luckily, I don't really have to, because that's been done by others for National Historic Ships UK. But in summary, it is of extreme archaeological importance for the development of inshore craft in not just the UK, but wider in Europe and on the eastern seaboard of the US. Because it's the oldest surviving, in fact the only surviving member of its hull class. It's the oldest surviving schooner, so we have a chance to look at how schooners were rigged in the 18th century, and there's no other source for that, not in real terms anyway. It's the oldest surviving vessel that incorporates various kinds of technologies, for example the sliding keels, so we can see how they were intended to work. It's of really preeminent significance, especially if you're a naval architect or historian. So for the development of yachts and small vessels, it's like the nation's grandmother, it's extraordinary. And that is all sort of bound up in its amazing state of original preservation. That it's because it's got all of its original timbers and paint that all of that means anything at all. If you add to that the fact that it has its own boathouse, and we know who it was built for, who built it, how much it cost, and where it lived, and what it was used for, and how it was sailed. And we've got letters describing it from the people who built it. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, really, that all of this should have come down to us.
During your time as a conservator, you've been doing it for, 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
You must have worked on an awful lot of projects and different objects.
Yes.
How differently do you treat them?
Well, the objective is always the same. What you're trying to do is to preserve the maximum amount of the original material and the maximum amount of meaning and significance through that you possibly can. and you're trying to apply techniques that are as light-handed as possible so that you don't do anything that can't be reversed and that your traces are easily read by people who may come later. And in that sense, this is no different from any other object that I've worked on. Most of my career has been spent working on stone sculpture, and that's a bit of a radical change for me. Stone is inorganic and this is organic, being made of wood. Being organic, it tends to move around rather a lot of its own accord. It swells and it shrinks and bits drop off it, and so, it's a bit different, but the fundamental principles are still the same. What we're trying to do is save every atom of the original material in as far as we're possible, and where sacrifices have to be made, it's for the greater good, always for the greater good.
How do you know how far to go when you're dealing with an object like this? For instance, it's got paint on top of the original paintwork. I mean, how do you decide whether to strip that back or not?
A lot of time is spent discussing these things. I'm constantly, right through my career, I've been asked, wouldn't it be better if you took this back to an original appearance, or whatever, all sorts of questions like that. But what it comes down to again and again and again is a proper technical understanding of what it is you're actually looking at and talking about. And in this particular case, my cherished objectives to remove all the rusty nails and replace them with timber plugs and make the boat completely free from problems of iron corrosion, or to, for example, take off what I consider to be hideous modern overpaint to reveal nice early 19th century, late 18th century paint that George Quayle left on the boat, have both been shot out of the water by the facts, basically. And since the boat's been in the unit here, we've done a lot of work, investigative work, with teams from across, looking at the paint, looking at the composition of the timber and the state of the timbers, and the composition of the nails and the state of the nails, and so on and so forth. And I have had to admit defeat on several levels there, but that's part of the job. You have to try to understand what the object is. When you do, you realise that some things are not possible. It's not possible to reveal the 18th century paint because it's already been largely destroyed. It's not possible to remove all of the nails without destroying about a third of the fabric of the boat. And so I've had to revise my opinion. Where do we stop? We stop when we've done the absolute minimum required to stabilise this vessel. And in fact, in this particular instance, we're going to have to stop a long way short of that because I can't remove the nails from it. We're going to have to present this boat to the public with its iron nails in it. And that is a compromise that I would rather not have made. But instead of removing them, I'm going to have to come up with a way of monitoring what they're doing. If what I'm planning works, the rate of corrosion will fall away, and the day beyond which Peggy cannot survive in her current form and all the nails need to be taken out and replaced with something else will be a very long way off. How will we know whether that day is arriving? We have to do some rather complicated and novel in situ monitoring, and I haven't exactly worked out how that's going to function, but I'm planning a sort of live scientific experiment on the boat that will furnish us with some data that will allow us to answer that question. But that would be after the boat's gone back on display. So we'll be getting live data from the boat telling us how quickly it's corroding and falling to pieces, basically.
So the job will probably never be done?
Well, in what sense could a job of looking after an object for an infinite number of years ever be completed? Successive waves of people come and do things to things. It was last treated in a really engaged way in 1951. I don't need to remind anybody that that's nearly 70 years ago. So it's not surprising that those repairs done in 1951 are beginning to show their age. And each generation has to reassess whether it's time to act on these objects. It has fallen to us to grasp this nettle, and we're fully engaged with that.
Objects Conservator for Manx National Heritage, Christopher Weeks. You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage on Manx Radio. Moving away from that 18th century yacht and going a little further back in time in the history of the Isle of Man, we take a trip to the Manx Museum to find out more about a very significant document from the island's past. Alison Fox is Curator of Archaeology.
The Chronicles is a medieval manuscript that was most likely written at Rushen Abbey during the 1200s and 1300s. And it is a collection of stories and events about Manx history, what happened with the rulers of the Kingdom of Mann and the Isles from about AD 1000 right up until about 1316. It's the first real book about Manx history, so it's a good few hundred years old. It really talks about the rulers of the kingdom from Godred Crovan down through the centuries. It talks about around about 15 different kings. It's full of their exploits, and it's got loads of information and stories about skullduggery and political shenanigans and murders and mayhem and everything. So it's treated as a very respectful academic manuscript, but the contents are really exciting and a really good read.
Do we know why it was written?
We have a suspicion that it was written almost as a souvenir booklet, if you like, for the consecration and the grand opening for Rushen Abbey. Most of the content had been written by a few years after the consecration of the abbey, so we think it was done in connection with that. But it also seems to be legitimising the rule of the descendants of Godred Crovan, so giving evidence why they were the rightful rulers of the Kingdom of Mann and the Isles as well. So although the events that are depicted in the Chronicles can be corroborated by a lot of other documentary sources, it can be a little bit biased in places, but essentially it's a true account of those 200-300 years of Manx history.
And there's part of it, certainly the entries about earlier times don't actually relate to the Isle of Man.
There's a small section at the beginning that talks about what was going on elsewhere, and we get references to other places besides the Isle of Man throughout the Chronicles. But that's really because at that time the Isle of Man was central to what was going on elsewhere in the British Isles, and also the kings of the Kingdom of Man and the Isles had influence and were influenced by the rulers in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England and Norway. So although it's very particular about the Isle of Man, it does draw in what was happening elsewhere as well, and there's some great instances of how the kings of Man and the Isles, their relationship with other rulers. There's one particular bit that describes how a particular king of Man sent his shoes to the king of Ireland and told him to wear them on his head as a mark of respect, and there's various passages about how the kings of Wales or princes of Wales and the kings of Man did and didn't get on. It's quite disparaging about William the Conqueror. It says that he subjected the English to perpetual slavery after his victory at the Battle of Hastings. So it's not a nice, polite volume by any means. It's quite short. It's only about 47 pages long, but the content and the detail is really fantastic.
How valuable is that content in terms of history and learning about history and the history of the Isle of Man, I suppose?
It's really crucial to this period of Manx history. We don't have the same artefactual evidence for this period, so AD 1000 to 1300, as we do for the earlier Viking period, the period after this particular kingdom was in place. And so to have the documentary evidence is really crucial and really helps us shine a light on what was happening in this particular period. And it's not just about the Isle of Man, it does give insights into what was happening elsewhere as well.
And you said it basically has a link to three of the sites that Manx National Heritage has: Peel Castle, Rushen Abbey and Castle Rushen. What is that link?
It's certainly the earliest reference to Castle Rushen. It's also the earliest reference to Tynwald in the Isle of Man as well, actually. And it mentions Rushen Abbey, of course, that's where we think it was written, so Rushen Abbey is central to the stories that are told in the Chronicles, and it mentions the fortifications on St Patrick's Isle as well. So as well as other places in the landscape, Bishop's Court, St Michael's Isle, a lot of these places in the landscape that we're familiar with today, some of their earliest mentions in documentary form are in the Chronicles of Mann and the Isles. And also, really interesting point as well, is it's the first documentary reference to the Manx, or Manx as a community, or Manx as a race, as it's called, the Manx race. So that's the first evidence we get that people on the island are being given that name as well.
How has it survived? Is it unusual for something this old to actually be available in the state that it's actually in?
It is quite unusual. The manuscripts of 1,000 years ago were written on organic materials using organic ink, so obviously decay happens over time. So it depends really what happens to them once their immediate use has passed. In the case of the Chronicles, the dissolution of the monasteries, so the closing down of Rushen Abbey, may have done it a bit of a favour, because at some point after the dissolution it was taken off the island. It went into a private collection, and in the early 1700s it was donated to the British Library. So because of those actions, it's been preserved. It's not just the Chronicles of Mann and the Isles. When it went into private collection, it was bound up with other medieval manuscripts which have nothing to do with the Isle of Man at all. But because it was in that private ownership, and then because it was donated to the British Library, then that's helped to ensure its survival.
In the Manx Museum, there's, I suppose you'd call it maybe a replica of it. It gives people an illustration of what it looks like, but it is in the British Library, as you said. It has been here, though.
Yes, it has been a few times. The British Library have agreed to loan it to the island quite a few times. Most recently, probably about 5 years ago, I think we had it for a temporary exhibition where we had some of the Lewis chess men, the chess set as well, here for an exhibition. It's not on display in the British Library, but what they have done is they've digitised each page, and people can go onto the British Library website and have a look at the digital images of each page of the manuscript. The text is in medieval Latin, but there's English translations available. And really to look at, it's a really unassuming little volume, really. It's not like these grand medieval manuscripts people might be more familiar with the fantastic coloured first pages and capital letters. It's rather more functional than that. It's all about the information rather than the visuals. Having said that, looking through the reproductions that we have and looking through the digital images, you can tell that it was written by different people at different stages. So there's about 10 different types of handwriting in there, which suggests 10 different monks had a go at writing it. There's little sort of doodle drawings in the margins as well of abbeys and things like that, and little sort of spots where some decay has occurred. But essentially it's not the most visually appealing, as I say, but the content is really, really crucial to inform us about this period.
Do we know anything about the people who we think wrote it?
Other than they would have been monks at Rushen Abbey, we don't know really any personal details about them at all. You can maybe tell perhaps different personalities and the different styles of writing. Quite early on in the Chronicles, there's quite a detailed list of the different years, so in AD 1000, in AD 10, all the way through. But then there's this little section that starts in about 1050, 1052, I think, where it says between the years 1052 and 1062, nothing happened. So you sort of tend to get a little bit of insight perhaps of the personalities of these people. But Rushen Abbey, like any other monastery, would have been the seats of learning. Very few people other than those in monasteries, certainly in the higher levels of society, would have been able to write and to create even the relatively simple manuscripts like the Chronicles.
How subjective is it? Is it a true reflection of the events of the time? You don't know about attitudes at the time, but of what actually happens as you know it from other evidence?
There's the essence of the truth in there, I think. There is bias. It was written for a purpose, and it was written by a particular section of society, so their beliefs come through very strongly. It's quite interesting to look at the ways that women are referenced in the Chronicles. They're not really referenced at all. When they are, it's usually quite disparagingly, or they're blamed for the downfall of the kingdom of Mann in the Isles. It's nothing to do with these Viking kings mutilating each other. It's, down to their wives not getting on. Apart from the few religious women that are named, and they're treated far more respectfully. So there's a bias there. There's a definite sense of the manuscript being written in a religious community, and with all those beliefs, and also with that desire to again emphasise that the kings of Mann and the Isles were the rightful kings, if anybody had any argument. There are other documents around the Annals of Ulster, for example, that do mention events that happened in the Isle of Man. and around, and we can corroborate the information. So, for example, it talks about the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Battle of Hastings, Battle of Ronaldsway at the other end of the period, and we do get similar information from documents from elsewhere. So in amongst all the drama, crisis and bias, there's a strand of truth in there that gives us the information about this period.
Is it something that would have been read at the time, or was it more of a secret document?
Yeah, and perhaps not so much as a secret document. That maybe makes it sound a bit more deliberate. But I think it was more of a token. It was something that was completed by the monks to show the history, to commemorate the history of the Crovan dynasty, and it wouldn't have necessarily been read out to the populace, but it would have been there to be used as reference in the future for anybody, maybe quibbling about whether that was the right thing or whatever. Then it would have been a reference work, really, more than something that was used on a day-to-day basis.
And are there any events in it that stand out?
Yeah, it's from the Chronicles that we get the information about the few sort of well-known battles that we have recorded in the Isle of Man. So the Battle of Sky Hill, which was when Godwin Crovan, after having escaped the English victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he eventually decided to consolidate the Kingdom of Man in the Isles. He came to the Isle of Man, he fought the Manx forces, he was defeated twice, but the third time he came there was a battle at Sky Hill and he eventually won that. We have other battles which in the Chronicles tell about how the bodies of the slain were still lying around on the battle site when the King of Norway came to visit. We've got at the very end of the period the Battle of Ronaldsway, which was the last kind of hurrah of the Manx Viking kings trying to take the Isle of Man back from the Scottish victory. So we've got these key points in Manx history that we refer to relatively frequently, but that information comes from the Chronicles of Man in the Isles.
Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Alison Fox. And we'll find out much more about Rushen Abbey, where that manuscript is thought to have been written, on the next edition of the programme. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be exploring more island heritage at the same time next week.